ask. I will shortly start in a minute or so. So if you have any questions or any doubts from previous sessions, do drop a message in the chat or unmute yourself and then ask. Uh, Hi, do you want me to start now or do you want me to wait for a few more minutes and start? Yeah, I think you're the only one. Can you let me know if you want me to start now or full factor, pre-dawn? Okay. Uh, sure. I will cover. I will try to explain those things. I have a slide there. I will try to cover that aspect. Okay. If you still couldn't understand, just ask me again when I'm covering the pull and push factors. Yeah. Sure. In that case, I will start because it's already 6:06. Yeah. So,
हाँ.
so, this the previous session. Uh, I meant to say the previous unit most was covering mostly about biogeography. So, what is biogeography? It it is area that mostly talks about how species are distributed. Especially, you study the patterns of geographical distribution of species and the factors that determine those patterns that you're seeing. So, a species can be present from an area, might be absent from another one, but so studying how which species are present where, and then along with that you also study what are the factors that determine the patterns that you see. So why a species is present in a certain area and why it is not present in a certain area. So there are different views, different ways you can say. Biologists, they prefer a more historical view and underline the importance of evolution of species and communities. So when you're trying to look at geographic distribution, you try to have an historical perspective of why the species is there, and then they also include the importance of evolution of species when you are trying to study biogeography or the understand distributions of species. Uh, so let's see. Let's go back to the snow leopard example that we discussed in the first session. So, where all is the snow leopard distributed? So, this is the range, global distribution of snow leopard. So, the area that is shaded in yellow is the region that currently has snow leopards. So, what does it say? So, it just say that the species is present here and the species is not present in these regions. It's just present in these regions. So, what can we infer? So, we will not be able to infer much on from this thing. So we have to understand the other factors, that talk about why the species is present. So if you want to understand why this, at least the snow leopard is present in these areas, you might need to understand how the evolution of leopards happen in general, the leopards as a group, and how the dispersal of them happen, and what type of habitat this species prefers, and what kind of habitat is present in this distribution range. Let's say, for example, snow leopard, well, let's assume that snow leopard prefers high steep slopes with lot of mountainous terrain with steep slopes. If you look, most of these regions, y- these are mountainous regions and has steeper slopes. So that might be one of the reason you are seeing snow leopard there. The other reason could be uh, there is prey, because it has to eat something, right? So where there is prey, it can the snow leopard is present. That can be one of the reasons. So there can be n number of reasons why species is distributed the way it is. Or it just happens that when the snow leopard started dispersing from its ancestral home, where or leopards started dispersing, this happened to colonize these areas and then specialize in this habitat. So there can be a number of reasons. So going ahead, so biogeography. Since you're talking about biogeography, we we should be able to talk about also biogeographical regions. So the earliest biogeographical regions, if you see, they were classified based on the fauna, flora and fauna, basically plants and animals, how the relationship, how they are. We have major biogeographical regions are Nearctic and Neotropical regions, which are together called as New World and then Old World, where we have Palearctic, Ethiopian, Oriental, and Australasian regions. And this is initially this concept of having biogeographical regions to differentiate the species, how they are distributed, was put forward by Alfred Russel Wallace initially, and then it has been later on modified, and then we have a new set of biogeographical regions which are recently updated. And same, we have Nearctic, Neotropical, but we have this Panamanian, which is the region specifically on the tropical belt of New World, and then simultaneously we have Palearctic, Saharo-Arabian, Afrotropical, Madagascar, Sino-Japanese, Australasian, Oceanic, Oriental regions. So, what does having these biogeographical regions help us? How do they help us? So, they help us understand, try to put up relationships of how species are, or to understand how species might have evolved, or how they disperse, or how they, if you're trying to understand how species, you know, react to climate change. So, if there might be some relation with how what biogeography they are from. So that's how biogeography, understanding the biogeographical regions becomes little important. So now, since we are discussing about biogeography or the distributions of species, so the question comes: why are species present where they are? Why is that species not present in other regions, or just why is a species present in particular regions? So there are a number of factors as we were discussing. So they can be grouped into pull factors and push factors. Pull factors you can call as those factors that attracts or pulls the organisms towards a specific place. Like, the most of those can be the suitable climate, food availability. Like earlier, if you are talking about the snow leopard example, where it needs steep slopes in the mountainous terrain to hide from the prey and then attack them. So that will also be a pull factor. So those factors that attract the species to the specific locality can be termed as pull factors, while factors that repel the organisms from a place are called push factors. Like, for example, anthropogenic impacts like humans' presence, a lot of species will not can't tolerate human presence. So what they do? So they just leave that area. They might go for they just vacate the area. They are not seen in that area because they might have gone somewhere else or they might have gone locally extinct. So such factors can be termed as push factors. If you again go back to the snow leopard example, if you one of the push factor other than anthropogenic can be plains. If it's in around the plains, it may not be you may not be able to see snow leopard because having a flat ground might not be what something snow leopard prefers. So you can basically group the factors how species are present. So earlier you asked, so how prey governs the population of predators. So so if you see here, the if you talk it here in terms of predator, let's say predator is P, prey is R. Okay, so wherever there is prey, the predator will also go, right? So basically, prey is pulling predators because predator wants to have food, which is their prey. So they will go to places wherever the prey is available. So this can be prey can be pull factor for predators, right? So this can be a pull factor for predators. But conversely, prey tends to avoid the places where predators are because it doesn't want to die, it want to survive. So it kinds of avoids the place where the predators are present generally. So presence of predator will be push factor. So it pushes the species away from the, away to different places where the predators might not be present. So so predation can be one of the pull and push factors. Okay, so that was what was I think that was what is explained using the Drosophila example. Uh, hope that was clear, right? As okay, you asked it right. Uh, so that's what the pull and okay. So you want me to go over the pull and push factor again, right? Then let me say it again. So if you talk in terms of predator, so you want me to go over it again? I will just go over it again. You want to know the case of Drosophila? Okay. Uh, in that case, so is it two Drosophila species or a single Drosophila species? Can you just let me know? I will try to explain it using that because I don't exactly remember the whole case. Two Drosophila species. So then you can, I mean, I presume, if I'm wrong, I will just, we can go back to it after this session is done and I can let you know from the video itself. So, to Drosophila species, what can happen is like D1, let's say Drosophila 1, Drosophila 2. So, there will be a competition going on, right? So, mostly it will be push factors. The whatever the dominant species of Drosophila is there, so it will try to, you know, push that small, the relatively low, yeah, relatively lowly competing ones. Let's say T1 has small competitive ability. It has high. Okay, so high competitive ability has D2, D1 has small. So since D2 can compete much more than D1, so it can D2 will act as push factor for D1. Basically, it tries to D1 tries to avoid D2 because it will not be able to survive, or it will survive in very bad conditions when D2 is present. Okay, so that's how it can act as pull factors. So, in contrary, if you think in terms of D2, it can compete with D1 way very easily than D2 itself. So then, presence of D2 wherever D1 is present, if D2 goes, so it will have greater advantage. So D1 can act as pull factor. Sorry, this is push factor. So D2 will push D1, and D1 will pull D2 to that area. So pull is basically, if you can also think it in terms of having favorable conditions. So since D2 can compete with D1 way better, it will try to come to those areas wherever D1 is present. Okay, since D1 can't compete with D2, it will try to leave those areas where D2 is present. So it will be absent from those areas mostly where D2 is present, or found in very few numbers. Since D2 is kind of driving D1 out of their area, you can call it as push factor, because D2 is pushing it out. Since D1 is pulling D2 inside, wherever D1 is present, D2 tends to come. If D2 tends to come, we can call it as pull factor. It's bringing in D2 into that. So I presume this was the example said in the lecture. If I'm wrong, I will. We can always go back after this session and then have a look at it. Okay. Hope it was clear at least here. If not, I will come back to it again. Don't worry. Okay. Okay. So you can basically group the factors that govern species. So it can be competition also. It can be mutualism also. If let's say if you talk in terms of mutualism, let's say if you're talking about a plant and ant mutualism. So wherever the plant is, the ant can also come and colonize. So that will always be a pull factor. If the plant is not there, the species can't colonize. So that will then it can be push factor. So it basically depends on how it helps the organism. If it helps it to expand to a new area, those factors you can call them pull factors. Push factors are something the exact opposite of it. So temperature and rainfall. So these are some of the uh, uh, some of the one of the some of the important regulating factors of almost majority of the species on Earth. So for instance, if you talk about pull and push factors, so same factor can be have pull and push effects depending on the condition. So for instance, if you talk about mosquito and malaria, so in dry climates, heavy rainfall can provide good breeding conditions for mosquitoes. Here, rainfall is attracting mosquitoes because in dry climates, when heavy rain happens, you can have puddles of water that will be ideal for mosquitoes to breed. And then if there are some infected mosquitoes, the malaria also increases simultaneously. So here, rainfall acts as a pull factor for mosquitoes. However, similarly, if it if rainfall gets reduced in droughts, can lead rivers into pools, and similarly make breeding sites. They can have higher breeding. But simultaneously, where in some areas heavy rainfall can wash out the breeding sites and reduce the incidence of malaria, because there is no longer population happening. So here the rainfall itself, it was pulling species into that areas or increasing the number of species. It's also decreasing the number of species or the incidence here if you're talking about malaria. So it's a similar factor can have both pull and push effect, and also depends upon other simultaneous factors or the geographic region you are referring to. So that's what I wanted to point through this example of malaria and rainfall. Okay. Uh, if you look at the biogeographical zones, they also roughly are represent the different biomes, at least capture different biomes. So, for instance, everyone might have heard of this term tropical rainforest. So, where do we find tropical rainforests? Wherever there is no annual temperature is highest and annual precipitation is highest. So, those regions we have tropical rainforests. Where do we have deserts? Where precipitation is lowest, we have subtropical deserts. You can have cold deserts. We can have tundra, where temperatures go way below zero, and yeah, shrubland, where you have high medium temperatures and then lower rainfalls. So you can base so here temperature and precipitation is something that's governing the distribution of forest type or the plants here, and then thus determines what forest or what type of habitat you see. And so of most of the habitats, let's talk about some of those mountain habitats that was you know touched upon in the lectures. Of the major mountain habitats, there is one is alpine forest, the other one is alpine meadows, and there is another important term called tree line that is associated with both alpine meadows and forests. So what are alpine forests? So forests is basically the forests that are found in the higher elevations. What you are seeing here on this if you think this as a mountain, the forest that you're seeing at this region, where you have most of them have this peculiar shape of cone, coney shape, so that they can withstand the high amount of snowfall that happens there and without breaking. And alpine meadows are basically, once after this you know forest ends, there is grassy meadows that comes up. Since they are present on mountains, they are referred to as alpine meadows. So, and then there is this interesting thing called tree line. If you see here, uh, there is up till one height, you see trees coming, and after that, hardly you see trees, or you see one or two sparse trees that you see around. And then after that, alpine meadows start. So the place where trees end, it's called tree line. So basically, with respect to the trees, so the line, if you roughly draw imaginary line where this huge swath of trees ends, that thing is referred to as tree line. So how do this habitat look in individual? So this is how an alpine meadow looks from the Himalayas. So this is a meadow, and this is where the tree line ends. So it's not like a single straight line. It is uneven because there are multiple factors that governs where the line ends at a specific place. So abiotic factors like temperatures, rainfall, or other competition related factors also govern why you see these unevenness in the boundary between trees, forest, and then meadows. And then alpine forests. If you have visited Himachal, Uttarakhand, or Kashmir, or even North Sikkim, the higher altitudes, you might see these strands of forest, which are dominated by the deodar and the cedar. So these are alpine forests. And then tree line is something that you already see. So if you look at you know on a single on a mountain, the type of vegetation you see from the base of the mountain to the top of the mountain changes. You know, it's like, for example, uh, if you take a mountain like in mostly in tropical region, let's say talk about Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary. So it has, for instance, uh, in the lowermost you'll have, tropical forests. As you go higher, it will give way to, broadleaf forests, and then you can have alpine forests as a third layer. And once it crosses the tree line, you can have alpine meadows. And then after a certain point, it's just permanent snow line. There is no vegetation that you see. Unlike if you have a similar mountain from temperate regions, there will not be, much distinction between different forest types. So this thing happens because as you go on elevate, as you go on from, you know as the elevation increases on the mountain, the temperature and the rainfall differs. Majorly temperature governs what type of forest you see here on the mountains. Okay, so since tropical rainforest, if you see from this plot here, tropical rainforests need, higher temperature and higher rainfall. But as you increase in elevation, as the increase in elevation happens, the precipitation might decrease, or the temperature will surely decrease. So as the temperature decreases, even with the same amount of precipitation, let's say 300 mm precipitation, if the temperature is 30 degrees, you will have tropical rainforest. If the temperature is 15 degrees or somewhere around 20 degrees, you will have a temperate rainforest. So you see a shift on the mountains in a close proximity itself. Similarly, and then this just goes on. So that's one of the reasons, why these mountains have, unique species, especially because there is this huge transitions in habitat that happens. So if there is, a species specialized in this habitat, another species specialized in habitat, another third species, you have three species here itself. But if you see a similar mountain with a uniform forest type, they can have, one species at most. Let's for instance, then, having multiple habitats, we'll have more species. Okay, uh, going on, let's talk about a little bit about migrations. Okay, uh, everyone would have heard about this term migration, right? It is not something new. We have all been hearing about it. If you so migration can be, simply put in terms, if you want to simplify it, is basically movement of organisms from one place to another. And it's not just other organisms, it's also humans. So regulars, if we talk it in terms of animals, it is seasonal because they tend to move only in specific seasons, and then this movement happens along fixed routes, mostly along fixed routes. And they can happen for a number of reasons, but one of the major reasons is for resources, because the places where they are staying might not have the resources, so they are trying to go to the regions where they will find resources, or to avoid harsh climatic conditions that a place has. So if you think, do we migrate? So humans also migrate, right? So some people might go to different countries for looking out for some jobs, because they are trying to, look out for some resources. Or if you look at places where there is, a lot of conflict happening, like wars happening, people also tend to, leave that places to look out for other places where there is, uh, there is no conflict. So we also migrate. So, and basically migration can be, of two types. If you talk in terms of it, okay, if you have a specific place, it can be immigration, where you know the and if you think in terms of humans or other animals, the movement happens to a specific area from outside region. So let's say this is an area of interest we are looking at. If some other animal some comes from outside, so this can be called as immigration, right? Or someone leaves this place and goes to different place outside, so that is called immigration. These are terms that most of us might have heard of. So so yeah, majorly the reason for this seasonal movement happens is for tracking, search in search of resources and to avoid harsh climatic conditions. uh, can you guys guess some species that migrate, or species groups that migrate regularly, or you might have heard that migrate? Do you know of any species that migrate? Okay, okay, then the Moisel crane, yes, yeah, that's a nice example. So, can you please elaborate on, if you want to, where this bird migrates to from, and to where does it go in its after finishing its migration? So, where does it move from to? Uh, if you just want to look at the species, the different groups that migrate, you can travel from Eurasia to India, Rajasthan, and Gujarat. Yes, yeah, you're right. So it also comes to in Gujarat also, I presume. So, what are different species that migrate? Species groups. So, one is obviously, which everyone would have heard and have watched for themselves, is birds. They migrate, from mostly from northern latitudes to much more to equatorial regions to avoid the harsher winters, because they may not be able to find food. The temperature is so low. So, and then there is equal opportunity to find food in warmer regions, so they tend to come to those regions. And there are mammals that do migrate, like blue whale, humpback whale, and these are examples of some oceanic migrants. If you look at wildebeest and Africa, in the African landscape, they are one of those keystone species you can refer. They just transform those landscapes. They follow these rain patterns that happens in African landscape, and then they just migrate from in the African subcontinent in huge numbers. Insects, it's such an interesting category. Monarch butterfly is the first example that everyone might have heard of. So they migrate from somewhere in southern parts of North America to to Northern America, northern parts. And common emigrant is a species of butterfly that you see in Indian subcontinent also, with that which migrates. And this other insect, globe skimmer, which is a dragonfly, it's such an amazing insect that it migrates all the way from Africa to India. And then it takes helps of favorable winds. Does reindeer migrate? I think they migrate locally, might not migrate large scale distances. So I'm giving examples of the large scale migrations or the longer migrations. I'm not sure about that much about reindeer. I think it depends on the area the reindeer is also from. It cannot be said migration. This small scale movement might not be said as migration because at least one of the main reasons they migrate, the species that migrate is to look out for resources and to escape those harsher climatic conditions that are present in the region they are coming out of, moving out from. So, if I'm not wrong, reindeers tends to stay put in most of those regions, even when there is heavy snow. But I can be wrong also here. I'm just speculating from what I know of. So you can term them as small scale migration, but if you define migration as large scale, or at least it should move at least 200 kilometers or thousands of kilometers from area to go to different area, then that might not be covered. It also depends on how we define migration. And generally, you talk about large scale movement. So there are species that that move locally also, which will try to come again. So this bird, globe skimmer, it migrates all the way from Africa to India, and then so yeah, and then there are fishes that migrate, like salmon. There are multiple species of salmon that breed in the ocean and then migrate upstream to their to the grounds where they have born to breed and then die. So, what does the species that migrate help? How do they help? Since if you talk about the skimmers, they are as they migrate, they bring in they also bring in nutrients because they change the nutrients from one place to another, because the birds that are present in India, let's say for instance, these have grown in Africa and have come to India, and then birds in India are feeding on them, like green beater is feeding on them. So this is getting, you know, they're transferring the nutrients from one place to the other place. Especially with salmons, most of the salmons they die in the upstreams. So where they have been feeding in the oceans, so they get the nutrients that is present from the ocean to the river, which helps in sustaining other organisms that are dependent on it. And then especially, and even with wildebeest, as they move, they also are preyed upon by multiple predators. So they're also an important aspect. So to sustain different types of species, migration really helps. uh, so since we are talking about migration as movement along fixed routes, so if you look at the migratory routes of birds, they follow these fixed routes. For instance, so what that comes on to Indian subcontinent majorly is called Central Asian flyway. Since we are referring to the earlier example of demoiselle crane, so here, so that species is a migrant that uses the Central Asian flyway. So basically, it covers most of this Eurasia, and then they they flock, they migrate all this way into the Indian subcontinent for to winter there. And there is West Asian East African flyway, where from the West Asia they go into the East Africa. And similarly, in Americas, you have Pacific America flyway or Mississippi America flyway. So it depends on where all it goes from and which all major places. So a species that is known from Central Asian flyway rarely, if unless until it's is blown away by storms or something, will follow other flyby. So it will try to follow its more or less single fly. So since we are talking about migration being along fixed paths, so most of the species migrate along fixed paths. For instance, and especially for birds, these are called as flyways. Okay, so each flyway is named after how a specific species or different species move from one side to another. So, for instance, if you take the example of demoiselle crane, so it breeds in Eurasia, as and then it travels all the way to India. So it mostly uses this Central Asian landscape, and then it has been named as Central Asian flyway. So most of the species, or at least the demoiselle crane, uses this pathway. So it just migrates from Eurasia trying to breed here. So they they breed here and then they winter in the Indian subcontinent. So they just do this up and down in this area. If you talk about a species that is using, let's say for instance, West Asian African flyway. So the species will breed in the western part of Asia continent, and then winters in the East African areas, and then again go back to these regions, and then in the next winter it will come back to this region. So basically they use these routes. So these are not solid routes. These are roughly drawn lines for our uh, a but easy understanding. They use these routes to go to and fro. Yeah, it's not just a single bird. So there are, there can be 100 birds, 100 species that uses certain pathway. It's not like there is no fixed number of which species, how many species uses which pathway. It basically depends on how, what is the wintering ground of the species. So depending on the wintering ground of the species, that species will migrate to those areas. So we just basically use that pathway. Let's say, for example, if you look at this dot here, if there is a species X, let's say, if it's breeding here and migrates to Indian subcontinent, it has to take this path, right? Which is the easiest path for it to travel. So we can say it is using Central Asian flag. But if it goes to East Africa from the same point, we have said it has used West Asian East African flag. Okay, so or if it goes to Australia, East Asian or Australasian flag. So it goes on like that. It cannot. It basically depends on the species, how they are migrating or where they migrate. And so since we are just talking about latitudinal migration, so this is migrating from northern latitudes to equatorial regions or southern latitudes. There is also this altitudinal migration that happens in birds. So if you look at this reed warbler, it shows you know latitudinal migration. So basically migrates from, chooses this Central Asian flyway and then comes into the Indian subcontinent. While this bird, the robin accenta, breeds high up in the Himalayas and then comes down to lower elevations in the winter, where when food gets scarce or the temperatures become too much low for it to handle, it moves down the elevation, come into lower elevation regions. Okay, so what happens here? Let's say, for instance, if you talk about in summers, so currently this is September. You can if you divide this whole season into March to September as summer. If you say this in summers, the species can be found from 3,500 meters and above. 3,500 meters and above. Okay, elevation, then only you see the species. But if you say in winter, the species will be seen from, let's say, 1,900 meters itself, because it has come down and then it may not be see the species beyond 3,000 meters. There may be few individuals, but let's in this hypothetical example. So the species have moved down from the elevation, from higher elevation, from where it is breeding or spending time in summers, to place a lower elevation where it spends some time in winters. So this is also migration because it's spending a lot of time here. So this is altitudinal migration. This happens mostly in the uh, mountain ranges, especially like Himalayas, and Himalayas is one of those examples. And then wherever you have this type of mountain ranges, at least some species show this altitudinal migration. There are some species that can withstand this cold temperatures. They just stay there. So let's see about some latitudinal migration, especially that comes into the Indian subcontinent. If you look at this example, this is a common crane, like demersal crane. It also breathes in majority of the Palearctic region, and then at least some of this, let's say for instance, this chunk of population breeds winters in Indian subcontinent, China, and then this population might go here. Okay, because if you think in terms of it, this will be easy for these people, these individuals to come here, these individuals to come here, rather than this individual going all the way back here. Okay, so this is their winter summering range or breeding range, which is generally what referred to as. These are non-breeding range or wintering range. So there are few individuals that were tagged by researchers from Wildlife Institute of India from Gujarat, so which they have gone all the way into Kazakhstan, northern Kazakhstan. And if you see here, somewhere I presume around here, this region, somewhere around this region, and then it has come back using the same, on more or less roughly the same route. So this species is using the Central Asian flyway. So this is one of the advantage of using uh, GPS devices for tracking species. We can understand the migratory paths of the species. When does the migration starts? When does the migration ends? For instance, for from for going from you know the species when it left India, onward migration to its breeding site, it took 15 days and covered 4,850 kilometers. While its return migration, it took a much smaller part of 4,500 kilometers, and it took just 12 days to come from the day it started migrating. But in between, it has few stopover sites also to rest in the night. And there are some species that fly non-stop. There's some species that rest. Going ahead, this is one of such a famous example that have been, a lot of people might have heard, is Amur falcon or Falco amurensis. So it's named Amur falcon because it's found in this region, especially in the eastern Siberia. It breeds there and then winters in Africa, and then it goes to winter in African region. Yeah. So there's an interesting story attached with this bird, at least in the Indian context. So yeah, this is how it goes. It comes into India. This is a data from tagged individuals, satellite tagged individuals. So the interesting story is this all. This is a photo taken from Nagaland, I presume, of this migration. When this migration happening, there is these many individuals, like some thousands of individuals that migrate together. So this is all Amur falcons that have come to roost in the evening after of, on their migration. So while going all the way, so they come into northeast India, and then go into Africa. So what was happening? So the thing that happened was they were being hunted by the local people, and so this was a conservation issue because, especially since most of the species during migration are much more vulnerable, and then because of convention of migratory species being put in place, this thing has to be stopped. So there was this initiative that was planned, to try to bring this up matter with the locals where, or the regions where this hunting was happening, and try to you know sensitize those people about why this should not happen, and why we should try to conserve the species rather than hunting them down. So as part of this thing, so they tagged few individuals, satellite tagged few individuals, and then this was, and they were tracked for multiple years. So this is one such bird that was tracked for almost, I think, 4 seasons or 4 years. So mostly they come into India and then they go into Africa. So they don't stay in India for long. So basically they're using India as a stopover site and then going to the wintering grounds. Similarly, the remaining individuals were also doing the same thing, coming from the breeding site, you know, staying in some of those places. So there are few roosting sites that were identified in Manipur, few roosting sites that were identified in Nagaland, where most of these species tend to come and come in these thousands and refuel them because they have been already flying here, and then once they had crossed India, they had to cross this huge Arabian Sea where they can't stop. So they had to refuel. So they are using some of these stopover sites in the northeastern India to refuel themselves and finish their journey to the wintering grounds. So yeah, so those are some of the examples. So now, after this tracking project, and then after uh, involving the local communities, now things are better, and they they now it's more like a festival whenever these birds migrate to those regions or through those regions in those places. And yeah, so, so really migration is such an interesting thing here that happens. And India is is on such a place where you get majority of the species that migrate to this, at least the subcontinent, Indian subcontinent. uh, yeah, I think I have till here only today's session. That's all I wanted to talk about for the day. If you have any questions, I can take them. If you have any questions, please drop them in the chat box. I will get back to you as soon as there are any. I mean, as soon as you write. So if you don't have any questions, I will. One of you, I think, has asked me a question regarding Drosophila, and let me just have a look at it, and I will get back to you. So it's lecture 21, right? pull and push factors. Uh, okay, can you let me know what time it is in the video? What timestamp should I go and check? So that so week 7, lecture 21, 15:35. Thank you. Just a minute. Ah, system is a little slow. 7. Slide 179. Okay. Thank you for those things. Just a minute. Yeah. I'll just get back. Uh, Hi. Yeah. I think. Uh, Let me just try to share that part and share the screen. At least I will try to show the transcript and hopefully try to explain using that. So basically here uh, starts with uh, the example of cactus, right? So if you have, there are two different types of Drosophila, right? And one of those Drosophila species, let's say, is Drosophila melanogaster, where they are trying to explain uh, is how this If you try to, you can basically raise Drosophila melanogaster by adding starch and cornstarch plus sugar in a vial. And if you add fungicides, the fungus might not be able to grow, but it will, the Drosophila will grow. But you add another species of Drosophila, which here is referred as Drosophila pachea, Pachea, right? When you add this Drosophila, so what happens to this same corn flower vial? It will not survive because this species is have co-evolved with a species of cactus on which only it can feed and survive. So when you add the cactus, then only it will grow, it can reproduce, it will grow, and then you can find the next generations coming of it. So what they are trying to say here especially is, if you add now cactus and Drosophila melanogaster, which is a fruit fly that a species of Drosophila that has not co-evolved with cactus, it will die, right? So what is happening is, here the cactus is something, and then Drosophila pachea is is a species that has co-evolved with this, and then can use some of those compounds to for its own benefit, while the species of Drosophila melanogaster is not able to use that. So it's not able to survive by just feeding on cactus. So what is happening here is, here the Drosophila is called a predator, at least the larval stages, which eat on the caterpillar. Generally, it should have been the herbivore, I feel. So since it feeds on the cactus, wherever this cactus is present, it governs the distribution of the Drosophila pachea, because they have both co-evolved, and then this species of Drosophila can only survive, wherever this species is present, this cactus is present. Okay, uh, where the species is absent, you will not find, this Drosophila species of pachea. So if this cactus is present in a certain area, so there is most likely the species to be present. So that's what I say. So if you have your cactus, you will have the Drosophila pachea on this cactus. If you do not have this cactus, Drosoph- the species of Drosophila pachea will not be there. So here, I think you might have been confused because there's a term predator and prey have been used for the context of this larvae, the Drosophila and the cactus. So you just have to think it. You can also think it as herbivore and plant. Melanogaster does not depend on cactus. So that was the experiment tell example where if you put Drosophila melanogaster in a vial with cactus, it will die because it's not what it has evolved with, because it has this compounds called sterols, which were referred here, which the species will not be able to, uh, Drosophila melanogaster is not able to use it. Yes, prey is cactus and predator is pachea. That's what it is referred into this example. So you might have got confused because prey and predator is not what you generally tend to use for a plant and a herbivore, right? So you just have to think it in those terms. Yeah. So yeah, that was clear. Hope that was clear. Right? Cool. If there is anything, Satak, you want to ask or add, you are free to go ahead and ask or add. So I can wait for a minute or so if you have any, or we can stop here. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for joining. Uh, Hope this was helpful for you to understand some of those concepts. Thank you and bye.